In October of 1997, a 15-year-old boy named John Hartman was beaten to death on the streets of Fairbanks, Alaska. 4 young men, 3 of them Athabascan Indians, were convicted of his murder. Yet years later, the case remains open and unsolved. Who's responsible? And how many killers were out on the streets that night? Was racism to blame for these convictions? I'm your host, Matt Ralston, and this is the story of John Hartman and the Fairbanks Four, case of murder on ice. Spurred on by the Alaska Innocence Project's Bill Oberly attaining a signed affidavit by one William Holmes, claiming responsibility, along with former friend and crime associate Jason Wallace, for the killing of John Hartman, the Fairbanks Four's post-relief conviction hearing would begin in October of 2015. In the time that would pass until the hearing began, Marvin Roberts, the frontman, won parole. Attorneys for the Fairbanks Four sought their immediate release, as well as the exoneration of their sentences. Along with Bill Oberly, the sole attorney of the Alaska Innocence Project, the Fairbanks Four were represented by a formidable legal team, including several attorneys working on behalf of Dorsey and Whitney, an international law firm with an office in Anchorage, which had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of pro bono hours in the lead up to the hearing of the Fairbanks Four. They also had the help of Rick Allen, who, like William Holmes and Jason Wallace, was a former graduate of Lathrop High School and was with Alaska's Office of Public Advocacy, which offers assistance to those with conflicting legal circumstances, of which the Fairbanks Four qualified. Here's Mr. Rick Allen sharing a few thoughts on his experience. Man, I really like talking to people from Fairbanks. That is so crazy to me that you have these 5 guys and they got 5 murder. They're in a car that night, rolling around like teenagers do. 5 Lathrop students. 3 of them end up to be murderers. They got 5 murders between the 5 of them. Like that's a scary crew. And you know, those guys were my age. I'm sure I rubbed elbows with them, ran into them at parties and whatnot. I recognized Bill. I never luckily had much interaction with him, but and then you had also downtown that same night was Dale Depew and his crew, and they soon around the time of the Hartman murder, they beat a cab driver to death, right?
Yeah, it's true. They dividends had recently come out. This is great that you're Alaskan, so I don't have to explain all this stuff to you. You understand it. But back in those days, there was no direct deposit, so everybody got a check, right? And so what would happen is these guys would get their check for $900 or whatever it was, and they'd just go cash it. And so you'd have all these guys walking around downtown with a bunch of $100 bills in their pocket, just getting shit-faced, bouncing from one bar to the other, and then there are people that took advantage of those folks, and that is not an uncommon thing. I mean, that was happening. I think that happened long before 1997, and but going down and just beating up guys and robbing them, that kind of stuff was happening. So you're right. There was a couple different crews doing the same thing. Now, what the Lathrop guys were doing, the guys that killed Hartman, they weren't robbing people for dividend money. They were doing another thing that was fairly common, because I knew guys that did that stuff too. I'd heard of this stuff before, where these guys were, going downtown and just basically, knocking out, inebriated men.
Well, drunk natives is how Holmes put it.
Right. I mean, exactly. They weren't always native men, but disproportionately so, probably. And they were just doing that for entertainment. They were just doing that, and I, like I said, I knew of other kids that did the same kind of thing, years before that. That wasn't a totally uncommon thing in those days. To just, for a 16-year-old kid to prove himself to his buddies, and they thought it was hilarious to just walk up to a grown man and just knock him out. That's the kind of stuff they were doing.
Yeah, when I read that, I was perturbed, to say the least. I mean, I know Fairbanks, especially in terms of just physical violence, fists and stuff, it's a very violent place. The crime rate's fairly high, and I know there's this whole fallacy of a small town being safe, and that's not necessarily true. But the level of fighting, I don't know. I've asked people from other places that grew up other places, like, was it normal for you just to stand there and watch two guys smash each other in the face? And, you get varying answers.
Right. I can tell you, my wife went to a huge high school in Houston, and when I tell her stories about my high school experience at Lathrop, she's just like horrified. The crazy shit that I saw, and things I saw at parties, and just like she just can't believe it. And when I grew up there, I didn't really know any different. I didn't understand how hardcore Fairbanks was until I left there. But yeah, I mean, in everything from the violence to drug use to, you name it. It's just an extreme place, or at least it was then. I don't know. I don't know that it still is. I just don't think it is to the same degree that it was then. But in the 80s and 90s, it was a pretty extreme place, and I don't know if what really drove that. But definitely, I saw kids even in high school, smash another kid's head through a trophy case. Saw tons of very vicious fights outside of high school, at parties, just really common stuff,
Yeah, even like Detective Ring, and it's hard to kind of know where his head was at and how honest he was being, but he seemed naive to the fact when he was interrogating Eugene Vent, and he said something like, well, there was a fight last night, and Eugene said, paraphrasing, there's fights every night. That's just what happens down here.
No. And the other super important thing to know, though, I'm sure you've already picked up on this from talking to other people and everything, but those four, it's not like those four guys were a crew or anything. The fact is, they had never even been in a car together until they got picked up from jail. That's the first time they'd ever even all been in the same car together. They were not like some crew that rolled around together at all. And they were in totally different places in Fairbanks. Like, when Hartman was killed, two of the guys were out on Chena Pump. You know where that is, way west Fairbanks.
Yeah.
They were at a party way the hell out there. It's absolutely physically impossible that they were together, and Marvin was at a wedding, it's just, God, when you go through the evidence and stuff, it's just so tragic.
Is it typical that, 'cause I'm not a lawyer and you're a very accomplished lawyer, so from my understanding, they were charged, and the prosecution was hoping to get back all this fingerprint evidence and forensics, and basically none of it played out, but they had already charged them. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
Is that normal?
It never did play out. Well, because in their mind they had, and I'm doing air quotes here, a confession, right? It was total bullshit. It's not a confession. And when you look at how the interviews were conducted and stuff, or the interrogations were conducted, it wasn't even, those aren't even, valid admissions of any kind. It was just total, BS. But they ran with that. That's what they told everybody. Hey, we've got confessions. These are the guys that did it. Boom, boom, boom. Because, I guess to be fair to them, to be fair to the police department, a young kid getting murdered in the streets of Fairbanks like that is totally unusual. As violent as, we're talking about violence and kids in fisticuffs and stuff, but some kid being beat to death is totally crazy. And the community was up in arms, and, rightfully so. And so there was a lot of pressure, I think, that the cops probably felt to get this thing solved quickly. I get that. But the fact of the matter is, there never was a single shred of physical evidence placing those guys together, placing them at the scene. Nothing. There never was any evidence because it never happened. And it is just so tragic that in the 20th century in the United States that this could happen. And even at the post-conviction relief trial, where eventually they were that we had 5 years ago, the state tried to bring up some old stuff that would just completely got blown out of the water in terms of, there just never was any physical evidence. Never. And to this day, there isn't any because it didn't happen. Simple as that.
Is it accurate to say it was personal to you?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah. These were kids from my hometown that were in my age range. I knew people that knew them personally, kind of a thing. And when I became 100% convinced that they were wrongly convicted and had spent the last 17 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit, then I was just like every other member of this team. Like, I wasn't going to rest until this injustice was righted. And we were all like that. We all had a singular focus like that. It was the greatest thing in my career to be on a team with lawyers of that caliber. They were just, and still are, phenomenal people, phenomenal lawyers, and it was an amazing thing to be part of. It really, really was. And I'll never forget it. I'll never stop believing in those guys and rooting for those guys. I try to keep in contact with them, and I've seen them since in the last 5 years. One of the guys has come and stayed the night at my house a few times and stuff like that. So I'll never, I'd say saying that it's personal to me is I would say that's a completely fair thing to say.
In the lengthy lead up to the hearing, some rather juicy behind-the-scenes drama was unfolding. Former state troopers and cold case unit workers Randall McFerrin and James Gallen, career cops, had been appointed by prosecutor Adrian Bachman to investigate the initial police work involving the Fairbanks Four, kind of an audit. The thinking must have been, and this is purely my own speculation, that these guys would look into the work of the Fairbanks Police Department and find that everything had gone down smoothly, that no mistakes had been made, and they'd end up testifying in court on behalf of the state that the department had a crack staff of civic-minded folks on duty, and that the office smelled faintly of chamomile. But that's not really what ended up happening at all. For example, pretty much right away, while reviewing documents, the investigators found the letter that William Holmes had written, confessing to his involvement in the murder. It was a fairly detailed account of what happened that night. The letter had been faxed to the Fairbanks Police Department in December of 2011, nearly 2 years before Alaska Innocence Project attorney Bill Oberle, completely unaware that this letter existed, was able to get that signed affidavit from William Holmes. The district attorney's office of Fairbanks had deemed a double murder convict's admission of another murder not noteworthy. After all, there was word going around town that some local teenagers might be throwing a kegger. This would have to be looked into. One of the first things investigators Gallen and McFerrin did was travel from their base in Anchorage to Fairbanks to survey the crime scene, and were beginning to find Arlo Olson's testimony, as well as other aspects of the case, problematic. They would go on to accuse the head of the state's team, prosecutor Adrian Bachman, of withholding documents from them, hampering the investigation she had appointed them to conduct, And the lead investigator, Randall McFerrin, would testify that he was terminated from the case too early, before his investigation was complete, before he ever had a chance to interview Detective Aaron Ring, for example. So the investigators and their boss, Adrian Bachman, arrived at the Eagles Hall shortly after the hearing was granted, to the site where Arlo Olson had identified the Fairbanks Four getting into Marvin's car and speeding away after assaulting Frank Dayton, a distance of 550 feet. McFerrin paced off the distance, and at the hearing both officers testified as to what they saw. McFerrin said his colleague was visible only as a silhouette. And this was my finding as well when I recreated this experiment. McFerrin also appeared to get snarky when answering Adrian Bachman's question under cross-examination about putting herself in Arlo's shoes, as he recalled his boss Adrian Bachman's reaction, looking at that distance for herself.
I had him walk down to the scene where Frank Dayton was allegedly assaulted, which was about 540 feet from the Eagles Hall front steps. He got down there, all I could see was a black silhouette and a white face. I could not make out who he was. I could not tell that he was wearing a hat, because he was wearing a hat when he left.
You didn't write in your report that I recognized Detective McFerrin, did you?
You didn't. You did not advise me that.
Yeah.
So we knew who he was. I'm describing, once he's standing out there, that you could not see him.
Okay.
And you stated, oh my God, and I didn't know what you meant by that.
Arlo Olson was one of the many cast of characters from the previous trials all those years back to make an appearance. He was doughy now, the fire gone from his eyes, mumbling and looking down, surrounded by supporters of the Fairbanks Four, looking on from courtroom benches, not thinking nice things about him. Asked if he actually identified the four, he shook his head. No, it was dark, it was far, I was drunk. He would commit suicide in his jail cell not long after this. Professor Jeffrey Loftus, the psychologist and visual perception expert from the University of Washington, took the stand, just as he did in the first trial. But this time, he carried with him an exhibit. It was a photograph of the actress Julia Roberts' face, factoring in complex mathematical data to show the recognizability of a face at a distance of 550 feet, but without the constraints of actually having to stand 550 feet away. Her face appeared to be a gray blob with a few dots for the eyes, unrecognizable. Loftus credits his development of this technique, now widely in use in courtroom exhibits, with his frustration in explaining the problems with Arlo's original eyewitness testimony 18 years earlier. Both investigators Gallen and McFerrin also testified in front of her that Adrian Bachman had potentially sabotaged their investigation. She refused to share Alaska Department of Law emails that showed the process by which Corrections Officer Joseph Torquato had faxed William Holmes' letter to the Fairbanks Police Department. McFerrin was also questioned about Eugene Vent's confession. He said that he would have done things very differently than Detective Aaron Ring, that he would not have interrogated a subject that was still intoxicated, and testified that Detective Ring had provided Eugene all the information that incriminated him. Asked if there had been any fact that Eugene had disclosed in his interrogation that only the person who committed the homicide would know about, McFerrin said, no. It seems this whole business with appointing the two investigators, ex-troopers, to review the case fell flat on its face. Seems like Adrian Bachman thought she had a layup, but what she got was a miss. Leslie Hammer, a forensics expert, was called by the Fairbanks Four to testify as to the veracity of the infamous boot print exhibit, which compared marks on John Hartman's face to the tread on George Friese's boots, and was physically constructed by the industrious Aaron Ring and prosecutor Jeff O'Brien, the pair having possibly made a run to Michael's Arts and Crafts to pick up supplies. She testified that in her expert opinion, the exhibit was straight garbage.
With that limited examination, I found no correspondence between the injuries that I observed, those feature shapes of the injuries, and any of the shapes of the shoe lugs as represented on that partial shoe impression.
Lieutenant Jim Geyer of the Fairbanks Police Department, who had worked on the case along with Aaron Ring, had some trippy thoughts on the exhibit.
We had the picture of John Hartman in our office. It was one of these pictures you sit there and look at it and see. I hate to give this analogy, but they sell photographs or posters that you're supposed to see a dolphin and you don't look at it, you don't notice it until you look at it for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then there's the dolphin. Well, that was those tread marks.
Yeah, you can totally see it, man, right? The state then called Lance Dalkey, another former trooper and cold case investigator, who had, years after the convictions of the Fairbanks Four, sent Marvin Roberts' filthy car hood to have some forensic tests done on it, as he theorized that the hood of the car may have a dirt spot on it that corresponded to some dirt found on John Hartman's pants. And nothing came of these tests. They were totally superfluous. But the state did seize on a piece of evidence that Dalkey now disclosed, evidence which was growing quite thin, that while examining Marvin Roberts' car, he had found something curious, a $10 bill. Now, remember way back at the beginning of the story that earlier that day that John Hartman was mortally attacked while out with his friend Chris Stone. The pair stopped by Lucky Ace's pull tabs, where John Hartman's mom worked, and she gave him, a $10 bill. Now, it would seem that John Hartman, as he didn't have any money when his mom gave him this bill, and having went to McDonald's and bought some gum after this, would have likely broken this bill. But, nonetheless, his mom gave him a $10 bill, and the Fairbanks Four stomped him out and went through his pockets, took this $10 bill, and now it was found in Marvin's car. Dalkey found this piece of evidence while doing his forensic examination in 2013, 16 years after the Fairbanks Four had been convicted, after the car had been thoroughly processed, with fingerprints done, carpet samples taken, swabs of the interior surface taken for human material, nearly everything in the car having been cataloged, such as the cap of a pen. And now, suddenly this. Not a particular $10 bill, just a $10 bill. That rare collector's item, a $10 bill, of which there are around 2 billion in circulation. Still, it was evidence. Evidence that was, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say it was planted. I have to check on that. Now, a woman named Margaretta Hoffman came forward and testified that she, all these years later, now remembered Marvin Roberts returning to his home the night that John Hartman was murdered and disposing of a bloody pair of tennis shoes in a dumpster. She had been at Marvin's house drinking and doing cocaine with Marvin's stepfather's brother, she said. Now, this seemed like a really big deal. But under cross-examination, it was revealed that Hoffman, who also goes by Crystal, if you know what I mean by Crystal, couldn't back up some very basic aspects of her own story, saying that there had been a wild party that night when, in fact, there was no party at all, for example. Being that she's the ex-girlfriend of Marvin's stepfather's brother, Many speculated that she was simply trying to get back at him through Marvin, that she was an entirely petty and loathsome individual. But still, was this reasonable doubt? Kevin Bradley, the host of the party that Eugene and Kevin the white boy went to, was back to testify, as well as many other alibi witnesses, reiterating that they had seen these guys places that night, and that Detective Ring had been pushy, tried to intimidate them when he had questioned them. Eugene Vent took the stand, saying that he was confused when he gave his confession.
I was feeling terrible. Guilty.
Why?
Because I thought I'd done something real bad.
Kevin Peace was aggressively grilled by Adrian Bachman about why he had lied about his whereabouts that night. Like Eugene, he also became emotional.
And he turned around and looked at me and he said, I got the right person. And he started telling me, Eugene Vent places me in Marvin Roberts' car. I keep saying I was in Marvin's car. I keep telling him I was never in Marvin's car. And he says that Eugene said that, and he says, George places us all together. You know, and I kept saying, man, I didn't do this. You know, you got the wrong person. I was scared. I didn't know what time I came back to town. I didn't know what time this happened to that kid. I didn't know what time it was. When I walked home alone, and he would say things like, we're way beyond that. I already know what happened. He looked at me and he said, well, the kid just came out of a coma and he's identified you. And he said, you're going away for a long time.
George Friese had showed up in a bright yellow prison jumpsuit, which, in case he had escaped and attempted to pose as a local businessman with an affinity for cross-colors gear, read prisoner in block letters on the back. Eventually, he changed into khakis and a crisp white shirt. They said I did all this shit that I didn't do. You motherfuckers know we are innocent. I'm so tired of this. I did not do this shit, he stated. Of course, the entire reason for these proceedings was William Holmes, who had written a letter from prison stating how that night, he and his 4 friends, including Jason Wallace, got into his car, looking to go beat up drunk natives, and ended up seeing Hartman alone. He spoke calmly and measured. He pretty much repeated what he'd said in his confessional letter.
We saw this person crossing the street on the other side of the street. So we all got excited and said, hey, we got one. And we waited for the guy to cross the street. I was waiting, and it was probably, it felt like a little while, but I would say it was maybe like 2-3 minutes. And I was debating whether or not to get out the car because I felt like they were taking long, and I opened up the car door. When I opened up the car door and kind of stood up, everybody came bolting back around the corner full speed, yelling, go, 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 go. And they all hopped in the car. I pulled out. I made a right. And I went across Airport Way, heading kind of towards, I believe there was a pawn shop right there, and Lathrop High School was off to the right. My memory serves me correct.
When the guys came back in the car yelling, go, 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 what was their emotional state? Were they...
Jason Wallace was in the front seat, and Rashawn Brown, Shomar Johnson, and Marquez, they were all in the back kind of yelling, man, Jason was tripping, little Jay was tripping, he was tripping, and they were all just kind of talking at the same time. And
Were they excited?
Excited, out of breath, all of that. And I was asking them, what happened? And they just kept saying, little Jay was tripping, he stomped him out. He was tripping, he stomped him out. So I looked over at Jason Wallace and I said, man, what happened? And he was just kind of just looking like he didn't even say anything. He was just in the zone, kind of looking forward, didn't respond. So I got angry at the way everybody kind of was acting. So I just said, man, hey, fuck that. I'm dropping everybody off. And I proceeded to drop everybody off one by one.
The Fairbanks Four called a guy named Scott Davison, who was a student at Lathrop High School in 1997, along with William Holmes, Jason Wallace, and the other members of their crew. Davison had previously put himself on record that Jason Wallace had confessed the murder to him soon after it happened. He was friendly with Wallace, though they didn't hang out often, but he found himself smoking weed in a car behind the Arctic Bowl bowling alley with Wallace and one other guy during school hours. While stoned in the car, Wallace proceeded to tell the guys how he and his friend had murdered John Hartman, and that he would go ahead and kill anyone else who repeated this. Understandably, it had taken Scott quite a while to come forward, which he did eventually, to the Alaska Innocence Project. Adrian Bachman responded by attacking Davison's character, that he was a known drug addict who'd been convicted of domestic abuse as well as robbery, that he was not credible. Jason Wallace was now called to take the stand. Skinny, rocking a beard, he came off as a gleaming weirdo, a coy, suppressed grin on his face, dressed like a flamboyant JUCO professor in a purple shirt, bow tie, and rimmed glasses, appearing almost giddy at the attention he was getting, or perhaps the occasion of being briefly out into the real world away from prison, albeit a courtroom. Wallace had been rather inexplicably granted immunity in exchange for his testimony by the state. Yeah, the guy alleged to have carried out the actual fatal blows, the murderer, was given immunity, and he denied having any involvement in the killing of John Hartman, despite his being implicated by William Holmes as well as Scott Davison.
Let me make it clear once again, just for the record and for everybody, I'm not cooperating with the state. The state called me as a witness because I can't just walk up here on the witness stand upon my own volition. Somebody has to call me. It's not my agenda. I'm sitting here right now just to tell the truth. And the truth being that I did not kill John Hartman, or was I ever involved in the killing of John Hartman.
You got that grant of immunity. You refused to say anything at all, didn't you?
Well, it's really easy for somebody in my position to be made, just like how you're doing, just how you'll probably continue to do and all your constituents will, to make me look like a terrible person. And you know what? I probably was a terrible person. I did terrible acts. But that doesn't mean that I did this. That doesn't mean I killed John Hartman. And who's ever accusing me of doing this is lying. I don't care who it is.
All of them.
Yes.
All of them.
Yes.
Every single one is lying.
Yes.
And you're the only one telling the truth.
If that's what it is, yes, I'm telling the truth.
Wallace had also apparently confessed to the John Hartman murder to his public defender, who represented him in his hammer murder and arson spree. The record of this confession had been sealed, but it was leaked and published on the Daily Newsminer's website for a very brief period of time before it was removed. Jason Wallace's public defender, Tom Bowles, testified that Wallace had told him he had killed John Hartman. Why did this guy have immunity again? Can anyone plausibly explain this? Absolutely ridiculous. Jana Lindemuth, an attorney representing two of the Fairbanks Four, said she believes that granting immunity encourages suspects to perjure themselves. She said that Jason Wallace was being called for the purpose of casting doubt on the theory that he himself was responsible for Hartman's killing. In other words, He was being incentivized, rewarded to lie on behalf of the state, whose priorities were to do a favor to a known murderer, identified by himself and his former associate as having killed John Hartman, instead of wanting to find out the truth, to keep 4 guys in jail, because this would show that they, the infallible state, had not been wrong in the first place, that they could never be wrong about anything, even when it was looking otherwise. But pride comes before the fall, they say. It was an emotionally conflicting day as the Fairbanks Four awaited their fate. This was the end of the road for them. There were no more appeals to be processed or granted. It was this or nothing. Supporters gathered outside of the courthouse, anxious. Finally, the judge ruled that their convictions had been vacated, that they were free to go. Many tears were shed as the guys were welcomed home at a potluck just days later. This nightmare was over. And that was pretty much the end. Well, actually, there were a few things still to clear up. Judge Paul Lyle had ordered the immediate release of Eugene Vint, George Friese, and Kevin Pease, as Marvin Roberts had already been granted parole. He vacated all of the sentences. This returned the Fairbanks Four to their pre-trial status, meaning they could be tried for the murder again, though the state said that would not be an option, as there would not be enough evidence to convict them again. Though I'd like to point out, there was the same amount of evidence as there was the first time. The Fairbanks Four would not be retried unless new evidence was presented, the state said. This meant that in the eyes of the law, of the state, the guys were free, but they were not considered innocent. They were granted what is called a conditional release. And as part of these terms, they had to withdraw their claim of prosecutorial misconduct and agree not to sue either Fairbanks or the state of Alaska at any time in the future for their troubles. Director John Skidmore, of the Alaska Department of Law Criminal Division, issued a statement saying, "The agreement reached today that the convictions were properly obtained and that nothing was done improperly, either by the Fairbanks Police Department, by the lead detective Aaron Ring, by any prosecutor that worked on the case. Instead, what has been revealed is that there is new evidence submitted that suggests if they were tried again today, it would be more difficult to convict them." So, Eugene, George, and Kevin were free to go home, to whatever homes they had 18 years ago, to whatever was still there waiting for them. I'd like to replace petitioners with the words convicted murderers, because that's the way I feel. Knowing they're guilty and getting away with it, I don't see how you'll be able to sleep at night, stated Sean Kelly, John Hartman's older brother. In 2018, a lawsuit was brought on behalf of the Fairbanks Four, who sued the city of Fairbanks and Detective Aaron Ring and 3 other detectives. They alleged malicious prosecution Brady violations, and a civil rights conspiracy, and asked that their previous settlement to not sue be declared unenforceable. A district judge struck that lawsuit down, ruling that just because their convictions had been vacated, that didn't mean the convictions were invalid. But that ruling was later overturned in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Supreme Court didn't take up the case, and the Fairbanks Four are currently moving forward with a civil lawsuit. The Fairbanks Police Department considers this case open. That's what they'll say if you ask them to comment on it, that they can't comment on an open case. But how exactly can the case be open while the state maintains that the convictions are valid? Can both of those things be true? If they got the right guys, why not close it? Doesn't make a lot of sense. However, granted the potentially lucrative civil lawsuit the Fairbanks Four have filed, the police department has been put in a position of publicly identifying themselves as hypocrites, or maybe just lazy people not interested in pursuing a murder confession by a known murderer. Since being released, Marvin Roberts now has a seat on the board of the Alaska Innocence Project and works for Doyon, which is a native-run corporation based in Fairbanks. He's active in the community and has become an outspoken advocate for Native rights. Eugene Vint is working as a security guard last I checked, spending time with his family, as well as starting his own family. He has a new baby. He looks happy in his Facebook photos. In 2019, Kevin Peace was charged with assault as he allegedly swung a baseball bat at a woman in a parked car outside of his house. An additional misdemeanor warrant was issued for Peace failing to appear in a driving under the influence case. In January of 2020, George Friese was arrested for driving drunk. He was behind the wheel of a stolen car. He evaded police, was charged with resisting arrest. All four men are still trying to get their lives back together. Now, the important thing, what do I think about all of this? What do I, one guy, think about the Fairbanks Four? Are they innocent or guilty? I've been asked this quite a bit. I don't think the Fairbanks Four should have ever been charged with murder. And I think this should color how we talk about the Fairbanks Four. If they had never been charged, they wouldn't have been found guilty. And those of us who don't know what happened, which is just about everybody, should keep that in mind. I don't think the burden of proof should be on the Fairbanks Four to prove their innocence. That being said, sure, it's possible some of them were involved, but I'm as close to 100% as possible, while leaving just the tiniest sliver of the anything is possible cop-out door open, that Marvin Roberts had nothing to do with this. He was at the Eagles Hall when this happened. Couldn't have been driving a car full of guys who stomped John Hartman to death. And if Marvin is innocent, given that the whole case was all of them being in his car with him, given that they're associated collectively, then in my mind that tells me that all four of them are innocent. Without Marvin, the entire case falls apart. But there are still questions. Maybe Eugene saw something. Interestingly, in his police interview, which those on the side of the Fairbanks Four say is just a bunch of rambling nonsense, he mentions a red Ford, the same type of car that William Holmes was driving that night. And maybe George did kick someone's ass. He has no idea. In his police interview, he states that his foot was already hurting when he got out of a friend's car at Midtown. Later, he'd say he heard it wrestling when he got home. Why did Kevin lie about where he was? He's explained it, but still, why? Maybe friends do stick up for each other. Remember when William Holmes said he drove by an alley and saw 10 native guys there? We don't know who they were. None of my sources serving time behind bars think the Fairbanks Four did it. Some don't think William Holmes and his gang did either. I have 3 aliases of people who may know what happened: Nairobi, Shadow, and Dragon. I know their aliases and not their identities. There may be a little bit of a contradiction here. Supporters of the Fairbanks Four are quick to point out that jailhouse snitches are not credible people. Take Arlo Olson, for example, who would say anything, truthful or not, for his own benefit. Or Joshua Bradshaw, the child molester who received a lenient sentence for his cooperation with the police. Yet they're holding up William Holmes, a psychopathic murderer, as evidence that the four are innocent. A guy who, from prison, is snitching on his friend Jason Wallace. Couldn't Holmes be doing something similar to any number of prisoners who come forward with information, hoping in some desperate push to get leniency in exchange? Holmes didn't say that he killed John Hartman. He said his friends did and singled out Jason Wallace. And why has William Holmes said nothing about the unsolved murder of Mahogany Davis, of which he most likely has knowledge? Perhaps because in that case, he's the one who did it? When William Holmes and Jason Wallace were on their murder spree in an attempt to expand their drug ring, Wallace, with his burnt face and reeking of gasoline, was arrested at the airport and quickly ratted out Holmes. He received immunity in California for testifying against William Holmes, putting him in jail for life without parole. Could this be an attempt by Holmes to get back at Wallace by testifying against him in Alaska? Further, when William Holmes wrote his letter, there were a few things at play which could possibly be considered motivating factors. First, there was a change in how prisoners were housed in California. Holmes was called a double LWOP, double life without parole. And at this time, legislation changed, in which all LWOPs had been previously doomed to never escaping maximum security prisons. They could now earn rewards, transfers, more favorable conditions in the prison system with marks for good behavior. Also, right at this time, there were legislative discussions about young offenders such as Holmes, who was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, of having a narrow path to achieving it. Still, it's unclear how volunteering his involvement in another horrific crime would be to his benefit. But it's possible he was hoping for some kind of Hail Mary to generate attention for himself and strike up some kind of deal for his testimony. Why haven't Dale DePew and his friends who murdered a cab driver, who were overheard talking about knocking heads that night, who'd mugged someone and return with $160 in cash, ever seriously looked into? What kind of car were they driving? That's what I want to know. To me, the car in question is the most under-discussed aspect of this case. Marvin Roberts drove a 1992 blue Dodge Shadow, the 2-door hatchback model. Dodge labels the color as bonsai blue. It's a brilliant blue. When Frank Dayton was mugged, he described the car the assailants were driving as a 4-door light-colored car, white or very light tan or gray. Arlo Olson, the star witness, discussed on tape how he came to identify Robert's blue hatchback. He said he initially saw a beige car that night. Quote, I said a beige car. Then they brought me up and showed me Marvin Roberts' car. Then it was, no one else drove that car but Marvin Roberts, you know. He kept saying that. We went through that 3 or 4 times before he decided to put it on the record and tape it, he said of Detective Aaron Ring. Police confirmed during trial that Arlo identified Roberts' blue car by viewing a single vehicle inside the station's garage. In other words, they had one car in the lineup for Arlo to identify. Arlo wasn't stupid. Morally kind of wrecked, but not stupid. And he says he put 2 and 2 together. Say it was this car. 9 months after the murder of John Hartman, Chris Stone, from jail, suddenly remembered a small blue car packed with white or native kids, with Kevin, the white boy, standing beside it. I hesitate to lend any credence to anything Chris Stone says, but he did say white native kids, not black kids. Joey Shank drove Eugene and Kevin to the wedding reception, according to the driver and others at 1:30 a.m., the time John Hartman was killed. The car belonged to Kevin Bradley, the host of the party's mother. It was a 4-door Nissan, similar in color to Marvin's car, and I've always found that interesting. So Frank Dayton identified the car the guys who mugged him as light-colored. William Holmes' car was maroon. Eugene Vent mentions a maroon car in his police interrogation. William Holmes says Hartman was alone, yet all the evidence points to Chris Stone having witnessed what happened. Holmes' story doesn't entirely make sense without clarification. I think that, obviously, a proper investigation has to be done, and that William Holmes, Jason Wallace, Rashawn Brown, Shelmar Johnson, and Marquez Pennington need to be questioned, investigated, and potentially have charges brought against them. There's no statute of limitations for murder in Alaska. I think Chris Stone, working as a fry cook somewhere in the States, doing God knows what with his personal time, needs to be properly questioned as well. He somehow never has been. Almost impossibly, he's really never been pressed for details. I think the state of Alaska and the Fairbanks Police Department owes the Fairbanks Four a lot of money. I think the actions of Adrian Bachman on behalf of the state to give Jason Wallace immunity, to potentially sacrifice the freedom of others rather than admit they could have been wrong, is disgusting. I think Aaron Ring was a bad cop, and I think he has a lot of company. And I don't think things have changed much in the last 23 years since the Fairbanks Four were convicted. I think bad cops are still out there running amok, doing whatever they want. I think there's a lesson in this. One of the most time-tested and true lessons of all time. Don't ever give up hope. Also, don't ever talk to the cops. Whatever happened to John Hartman that night, I hope that those responsible, if they haven't already been, are brought to justice. It's truly been eye-opening just seeing how many killers were out that night. Guys who are in prison and guys who just killed a guy once for the hell of it and are now walking among us, selling us cars, teaching us Taekwondo. Look out for your family. Look out for your friends. Look out for your kids. The following people declined to talk to me or just didn't respond. Chris Stone, E.J. Stevens, Trent Muller, Dale Depew, John Holloway, Sean Aldrich, Filthy Fuhrer, Jason Wallace, Marquez Pennington, Rashawn Brown, Shelmar Johnson, Aaron Ring, Deputy Kendrick, Jim Geyer, Adrian Bachman. Thank you so much to Rick Allen for his interview and help, and to some of the other attorneys who worked on the post-conviction relief hearing who were super cool and really helpful. Bob Bundy, Whitney Glover, Michael Grisham. If you have any information about this case, email me, alaskapodcast@gmail.com, or contact your local law enforcement. If you're in Fairbanks, though, I probably wouldn't write them a letter. Follow us on Instagram, Murder on Ice. Twitter, Murder on Ice. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter, The Matt Ralston. That's The Matt Ralston. Please tell a friend to listen and to rate and review this on iTunes. It'll take you about 5 seconds. It's super important. I'll be following up with any leads or details or developments in this case. I'm still working on a good trademark sign out. I haven't really got anything good yet. But maybe I guess this is a bad time to start. I'll just try. Written and produced by me, Matt Ralston. Music by Arlo Sanders. Thanks, buddy. Well, as always, I'm Matt Ralston, and keep your sheets dry. Shit, that's not very good. I'm Matt Ralston, and I'll see you at brunch. Fuck. I've been Matt Ralston. Verily, I say. That sounds too much like virally. I'm Matt Ralston, and there's no cure for hiccups. I'm Matt Ralston, and your dog is annoying. I'm Matt Ralston, and I'm on cloud 9. I'm Matt Ralston, and remember to live every day as though you have 5 to 10 left. I'm Matt Ralston, and always remember, the brain's the biggest part of the body. I'm Matt Ralston. Remember, be kind to strangers, unless they look at you funny, then stare at them menacingly. I'm Matt Ralston. And, I'll be around. Oh, that's pretty good. If you have any suggestions, email me. Okay, I gotta go.